Okay, everybody ready to start? Is the sound good? You guys, everybody can hear me okay? All right. Okay, my name is Jeff Leigh. I'm a professor of history in the history department here at UWSP, both on the main campus and on the Wausau campus. I did my graduate education at University of Indiana, Bloomington, in East European history with a minor field in Russian Soviet history.
And I am Jeff Snowbarger. I am an associate professor here in the English department. You might think it's strange, why is an English professor talking about some of this stuff? A lot of it has to do with the personal interest that kind of started up that led into further academic studies. I had the opportunity to study at Lobachevsky State University in Nizhny Novgorod, where I studied Russian history and literature, and then continued working in Russian literature in graduate school when I was studying comparative literature, doing translations of Chekhov. So this region is personally near and dear to my heart, and I know a lot of us have been seeing a lot of images that are kind of filtering into our heads, and one of the things that we hope to accomplish tonight is to give folks a certain kind of framework to be able to understand how to process some of these things as they're unfolding in real time.
Great. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get us started. What I'm going to begin with then is a short dissertation, which means a short writing actually, on the current state of affairs, and then we'll go into how we got here. Talking a lot about Vladimir Putin's view of Ukraine and other crises, and then we'll talk about what I would just generally call the Ukrainian national perspective, which at its root is that there is such a thing as the nation of Ukraine, and that the nation of Ukraine has certain interests and certain rights. Okay? And then after that, we'll go into a little bit of the history that helps explain how these ideas developed of the existence of the Ukrainian people, and in Russia, among some, the idea that there is not, in fact, a Ukrainian people that's separate from the Russian people. We'll then go to Q&A after we've covered all of that material, and that's where I think we'll probably get most of the specific questions on things like where is it going from here, which is usually what the audiences are most interested in. Not simply how we got here, but where we think it might be headed. Okay, sound good to everybody? Okay, great. Okay, so we'll start into this and we'll see where it goes. So as you probably already know, on February 24th, okay, just about 2 weeks ago, Vladimir Putin, right, who had been assembling troops, some 200,000 troops on the border of Ukraine for the preceding 2 months, declaring along the way repeatedly, we are not going to invade Ukraine. These are training exercises. We are not going to invade. On February 24th, he conducted what he called a special military operation, what everybody else calls an invasion, sending those troops across the border. The stated goal is to demilitarize and to denazify the Ukraine. He further stated, quote, any bloodshed would be entirely on the conscience of the regime ruling on the territory of Ukraine, end quote. The initial military goals appear to have been the desire to gain air superiority. The first goal is to make the electronics work. You know, this worked fine. It worked too well. Okay, the first goals appear to have been to gain air superiority. Once you have air superiority, it's much easier to control the pace of the battle on the ground. But that didn't go so terribly well. Still today, the Ukrainian Air Force is flying, and the Russian Air Force is flying in a manner far reduced from what we thought it would be by this time. Another goal was to first encircle and then to penetrate Kiev. I have a problem with that because I was trained in Russian, not in Ukrainian. And so the first thing that always comes to mind is the Russian pronunciation. You'll see on the maps, after the Al Jazeera map, that the BBC still has that problem, and so does the Washington Post. Okay? We haven't entirely switched, as we started to do in 2014, to actually use the terms that the people of Ukraine prefer for their own cities, or at least the majority does. All right. to penetrate Kiev and to decapitate the government, to remove the head of state, and we would think to replace it with somebody more to Putin's liking, although he has not stated any of that clearly. They also moved troops in from the south and from the east to try to take the major cities and this area here called the Donbass, which you see in this kind of mustard color. That's the region, at least in the dark red color, that separatists have claimed as their own since 2014. You remember in 2014, it was Russian troops masquerading as who knows what. They weren't claiming to be Russian troops, and they had all their insignia taken off of the uniforms. But they invaded that region and established separatist regions there that then on the 22nd of February, Putin declared would be understood in his mind as independent of Ukraine. So gain control of those entire regions, likely with the idea of making them independent and perhaps later countries incorporated into Russia itself. Given the size of the Russian military and given the tradition of the Russian military to hit an enemy with overwhelming force, that's what we saw in Chechnya, that's what we saw in Georgia in 2008. That's what we thought Putin would do this time too. And that, given what we were told in the news about the scale of the Russian military and the much smaller scale of the Ukrainian military, we assumed this thing would have been well over by now. That was the impression that we were given. Then, strange things started to happen. During the first days of the assault, I was amazed that the casualty counts reported on the Ukrainian side were so low. I mean, it's horrible. Every single death is a horrible tragedy, but I suspect it was going to be much worse. And then we noted how slowly the Russian units were moving across the terrain. Since then, we have found out that they lack fuel, that they lack food, that the Russian logistics system, that way of getting supplies to the troops, is horribly inadequate to the missions that they're supposed to accomplish. And so we have abandoned vehicles on the side of the road, run out of gas. We have Ukrainians sometimes stealing tanks. That kind of thing is happening. Okay? So the lack of food, the lack of fuel, it appears that there's a lack of motivation among many of the Russian soldiers. They're conscripts after all. 18, 19-year-old draftees. They don't seem to be, in many cases, aware of why they're there, or what they're really supposed to be doing. They still don't have control of the air. There's that 40-mile-long convoy stretching from about 15 miles north of Kiev up towards the border, stuck in place. And we don't know exactly why. Part of it has got to be Ukrainian resistance. Part of it is likely lack of fuel or lack of food. In all cases, it's a failure of coordination on the part of the Russian military. You do not leave a convoy like that vulnerable in those kinds of locations. Okay? Last week, the Russian military stated that they had suffered somewhere in the magnitude of 500 deaths, 1,500 wounded soldiers, and about 600 captures. Altogether, that means casualties, right? Dead, wounded, captured, somehow taken out of the fight. Okay, it's about 2,500 troops. Yesterday, the U.S. military, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, estimated that Russian losses, deaths, were somewhere in the magnitude of 2,000 to 4,000, which means you could have a total casualty count somewhere between 10 and 20,000 if those ratios hold. But again, we don't know. None of this can be confirmed. And of course, in every war, you never exactly know how many casualties there's been because you can't count effectively. But it is much higher than expected and much more painful than you might think. 1.5 million Ukrainians have already fled their country, though. It's a lot easier to count there, although again, precision isn't part of counting numbers of people on this level, and we don't know how many dead or wounded or captured. Because again, in this environment, extremely hard to know, particularly since the Ukrainian military seems to be strongly decentralized. So concentrating information in one place seems to be quite an issue under the best of circumstances. Additional things that were never expected, certainly not expected by Vladimir Putin, is the resolve shown by the United States, by NATO, and then also by other members of the international community. Putin appears to have gambled on the United States being weak and divided, but the United States has shown very strong resolve. He gambled on NATO being weak and divided. NATO and its connection with the United States now is once again very strong again. And not only that, but Japan has launched important sanctions against Russia. Taiwan has launched important sanctions against Russia. There's a very strong coordinated international system of sanctions. Russia is now the most heavily sanctioned country on the planet. There are more than 5,000 specific sanctions against Russia, and more than North Korea, Iran, or Syria. And this is the scale of things that are operating. Russians have been pushed out of the SWIFT financial system. And what that means is that it's extremely difficult to move money around between financial institutions, even in Russia itself, and nearly impossible to move money between Russia and other countries. Extremely difficult. This last week, the European Union announced that they were cutting their importation of Russian gas by 2/3. That still continues to flow, but at a 2/3 loss now to Russia, and they're selling at a discount because they need the income. The United States just yesterday cut off all importation of Russian gas and oil. Now that's a small part. That's maybe about 3% of the American usage of gas and oil. For Russia, that's of course much more of an important figure. Okay? The ruble has lost more than 2/3 of its value. The Russian stock market remains closed. They're not buying and selling any stocks in Russia right now. According to the Fitch rating system, Fitch is the #1 agency on the planet for rating the creditworthiness of governments. They gave Russia a C rating. C rating is default, means default is imminent. A good rating is AAA, right? That's what you want to shoot for. Russia now has a C rating. There have been runs on banks in Russia, and there is now rationing of flour and sugar in Russia. Tens of thousands of Russians have fled Russia. Many people who can get out are getting out. And Putin and the Russian parliament have clamped down harder on civil society than at any other time during his rule of Russia, making it harder and harder to exchange information or to present any information to the public that is disfavorable to the government. And so suffering in Russia is increasing, but of course suffering in Ukraine is much harder, being in the sights of this much firepower. Because of their failure to advance, the Russians in the last week and a half have started shelling residential neighborhoods. Not a whole lot of it is from the air because they don't control the air. A lot of it is rockets and missiles, which are of course a lot harder to interdict than our aircraft. Okay? So a tremendous amount of suffering. Well, why is this all happening then? How did it get started? Why did Putin decide to do this? It goes back to what he believes about Ukraine. And that's diametrically opposed to what we tend to find Ukrainians saying they believe about themselves. Okay? Putin's claims, and if you want to know Putin's claims, it's real easy. Go on Google. All you got to do is Google Putin and July 12, 2021. And the first thing that'll show up is this article that he published on July 12, 2021, which is entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And that already kind of gives you a picture of where this thing is going. According to what he states in that article, the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, right, the people directly to the north and a little bit to the west there. I'm working backwards here. I can't get east and west based on. But right up there, Belarus, Putin maintains in that article that they're really all the same people, that they all come from the same East Slavic linguistic basis, that over time you get some differentiation, but ultimately they're one people in 3 different branches. And that according to this, according to what Putin himself has written, the Ukrainians are not legitimately a foreign people. And this is not legitimately a state. Their language is a branch of Russia. Belarus, the same thing, not legitimately a separate people, a separate state, separate language. They are integrally a part of the common Russian experience. In fact, he argues there's no such thing as a politically separate Ukraine until the Soviet Union made the mistake of creating it back in the 1920s. Okay? When they created separate administrative districts named after different ethnic groups. A Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, a Belarusian Soviet Republic, a Russian Federated Soviet Socialist Republic, etc., all together in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Before that, he says, there's no such thing as a separate Ukraine. And he says, this was a horrible mistake. And that this robbed Russia of land and people that were rightfully its. Okay, these are his words, not mine. And also, that the people of Belarus and Ukraine would like to be part of Russia. Of course, he claims this with absolutely zero evidence given. It is simply an unsubstantiated claim. Okay, so why is there a separate Ukraine? Well, in Putin's own words, it's because radicals, fascists, Nazis, foreign entities have conspired against the common Russian people, forcing these people into states that they indeed don't want to be part of. Now, what does he believe? Well, as a historian, I can tell you, you can never know that about anyone. They tell you what they tell you, okay? But you don't know if he believes it, but he's operating under those assumptions. Now, on what I call the Ukrainian or Ukrainian national side, there is a belief that Ukrainians constitute a separate culture. There's a culture argument, just like there's a culture argument that Putin's making. On the Ukrainian side, you can also say there's a legal argument, because there's no legal argument on the Russian side of this, or on the Putin government side of this. August 24th, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament, then known as the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, adopted the Act of Independence that removed their lands from the Soviet Union. Remember, at the same time, the Russians were doing the same thing, and so were the Belarusians and then the other republics, the Baltic republics, way up to the northwest, having done it already even before the fall of the Soviet Union. That decision, and that Supreme Soviet had been actually elected in 1990, what are seen as pretty good, pretty fair elections, still during the Soviet period. So they declare their independence, and then they hold a referendum on December 1st, 1991, and it passes. Independence passes with over 90% approval. You don't usually see that in any kind of fair elections, but we have no evidence that that was an unfair election. Okay, so it stands. On December 8th, Russia and Belarus both recognized Ukrainian independence. So there's a legal statement from the Russian government, the Belarusian government, that this is indeed a separate sovereign country. Ukraine, since then, of course, joined the United Nations. It joined the World Trade Organization. It joined the IMF, International Monetary Fund. It joined the World Bank, etc. And it has sought EU membership, and it has sought NATO membership. It is recognized internationally as a sovereign separate country, and that also includes other treaties with Russia. In 1994, they signed the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurance. This is where Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a pledge from Russia, Britain, and the United States to respect its borders. One problem with that treaty: there is no enforcement mechanism. You know, you wonder sometimes why laws or treaties are so long. Is that because they have to have enforcement mechanisms for them to have weight? Okay? There's a lot of good reasons for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons at that time. Today, of course, some people are questioning that, as you might well imagine. 1997, there was a Ukrainian-Russian treaty on friendship, cooperation, and partnership. Since then, of course, it has lapsed. Most treaties are for a specific period of time. It was allowed to lapse in 2019. And with, of course, the Russian invasion of the Donbass and Crimea, you could well understand why new treaties were not being signed. Okay? So how do we get to this situation? What is the history of these lands? And I'll try to be relatively brief. If you don't want to laugh, you can at least smile at that, because historians are never relatively brief, right? We do what we can. But as I said when I was writing my own dissertation, I did all this work. Somebody's going to have to hear it. So bear with me. All right, if we look at the 7th and 8th centuries, in this region that becomes Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, there's a great variety of peoples out there speaking a great variety of languages. We can't know about minorities, majorities, but there's a lot of East Slavic language, not yet defined right as Russian, Ukrainian, etc., that exists in those regions. In the 9th and 10th centuries, a political power evolved in Kiev, right there in the Dnieper River. We question what to exactly call this. Is it a state? Is it a trading company? Well, the whole purpose of it was to control the trade in the rivers, running all the way from the Baltic Sea in the north down to the Black Sea in the south. That's the way that they financed themselves. And so from Kiev, you have a principality, and then it's recognized by the Byzantine Empire down here as a grand principality. With Kiev then sending princes up through the river systems to establish towns and to run in the name of the Grand Prince these different regions. Okay? So this all begins, this is what we call Kievan Rus, right? It's what it was known at the time. During the 11th through 13th centuries, that centralized power broke down as the princes fought one another endlessly. First for control of Kiev, and then of course for control of the surrounding areas. You see on the map, also in the first half of the 13th century, the Mongols are invading. The Mongols will come in and take control of the grasslands, most of what's today Ukraine. The forested regions that are going to become Belarus and Rus and Russia are, of course, harder going for cavalry forces. Those are old growth forests at that time at least. And so they employed Russian princes as their tax collectors up there. So you're starting to get an important differentiation between the two regions. As we move forward into the 14th, 15th, etc. centuries, all the way up to the 19th century, what you see here is the expansion of the Russian Empire at the expense of Poland, Lithuania, everybody in between, the Ottoman Empire from the south there, this expansion of Russia further and further and further to the south and further to the west. By the end of the 18th century, most of what we think of Ukraine is firmly in Russian hands. And it's generally treated as a military borderlands, not fully integrated into the entire civilian government of Russia. Not yet, at least. Putin claims that, yeah, originally all of us East Slavic peoples were together. And the center of gravity of that civilization moved from Kiev to Vladimir Suzdal, and then ultimately to Moscow. And it's Moscow and what they're called the Veliki Rossiya, right, the great Russian people, that they are the real bearers of this long tradition. Belarusians and Ukrainians are just minor branches in that family. Ideally, under a central combined Russian power. As, of course, NATO, after the end of the Cold War, come on. Can you do that manually up there, Jeff?
Oh, there you go. I think you got it.
Nope, I'm looking for the NATO map.
It's up here on the screen.
It's on the screen.
Yeah.
It's just not here. And this is our brand new building. Okay? But this thing is probably not brand new. At least the batteries. Okay, well in any case, everybody has like a NATO map in their head, right? Of course you do, right? Of course you do. Okay. We'll keep fiddling with this, see what happens. Sometimes it is just magic. Oh. Okay, but in any case, since the end of the Cold War, of course, NATO has expanded westward, right? The Warsaw Pact countries are all NATO countries now. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, those Baltic states, all NATO now. Ukraine, of course, at various times has requested NATO membership, as they requested EU membership. And the way Putin presents it is the way it was presented during the Soviet Union, during the era that he grew up in. That this is an expansion of antagonistic Western power at the expense of Russia. That's his claim. That's the intellectual world he lives in. Now you can imagine Ukrainians see things maybe a little bit differently. Ukrainians see themselves as culturally different from the Russians. They see their language as independent, separate from the Russian language. In fact, if you look at the Ukrainian historiography since 1991, and that's, historiography is the study of the way historians look at history, right? Or it's the whole volume of the way the historians have looked at history or created history. What you find there is some Ukrainian historians say, you know what? You want to talk about somebody being the legitimate heir of the old Kievan tradition? That's still us. And Russia is just a small branch, or maybe a big branch, in what legitimately is Ukrainian. So some of them are putting, things off the Russian perspective on its head, though. But any way you look at it, there we go. And so, since 1997, among Putin's claims are that NATO force postures should go back to pre-1997, right? So there should not be any U.S., etc. troops in those lighter purple states. Okay? In other words, they should be more vulnerable. Okay? All right. So what has developed in Ukraine over time is a different way of seeing the world based upon their own experiences. And to explain a little bit more about that, and particularly about the Ukrainian national renaissance of the 19th century, I give you Jeff Snowbarger.
So I'm going to talk about, Jeff did a really good job of kind of talking about some of the political interplay that's been taking place for a very long time in the region. One of the ways that as a writer and a person who's really interested in literature, I look at things at a cultural level, not necessarily at a state level or, a lot of times even at like a date level. But clearly from the maps, you can see that there's a lot of overlap between what Russians want to claim is theirs, and a lot of times the Ukrainian people are quite literally just swept up in these big movements within history. But to understand some of the cultural connections within this region, it's really difficult to unbraid, to unknot. As Jeff mentioned, one of the arguments that Putin has been making is that Ukraine is actually, the seed kind of idea of what actually, fully blossomed into the Russian idea. And there's a lot of reasons for this. There's a lot of religious reasons for this. There's even alphabetical reasons for this. The Eastern Orthodox Church that Russia ended up adopting was really kind of born and raised in Kiev, and Russia ended up kind of adopting it. Since that adoption, over the years, there have been kind of multiple periods, multiple swings between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, almost fighting kind of like some Protestant denominations do about the purity of what their believers think and how they carry themselves. Here's some examples of how this kind of cultural overlap has worked through time. So in the reign of Catherine II, one of her court poets actually penned a poem, and the poem was called A Conversation Between Great Russia and Little Russia. For a long time, Russians wouldn't even consider calling Ukraine something other than Little Russia. And we're still seeing this stuff play out several hundred years later. But here's a little snippet from this poem. So this is Great Russia speaking. Do you know with whom you are speaking, or have you forgotten? I am Russia, after all. Do you ignore me? Little Russia replies, I know that you are Russia. That is my name as well. Why do you intimidate me? I myself am trying to put on a brave face. I did not submit to you, but to your sovereign, under whose auspices you were born of your ancestors. Do not think that you are my master. Your sovereign and mine is our common leader. So all the way back in the 1700s, there are Ukrainian voices, or at least ideas, where Ukrainian people are pushing back and saying, not so fast. We might have, an imperial order kind of hanging over our heads, but we recognize a separate identity. A lot of this stuff really kind of boils to the cultural surface in the kind of around the 1830s. There are quite a few Ukrainian poets who are very boldly within kind of Tsarist Russia stating that they're proudly Ukrainian. On the back of the kind of book list that's up on the table, you'll find a poem that was written in 1830. Now, keep in mind, when this poem was written, Ukraine was technically under the sovereign kind of domain of would that have been the Russian Tsarist Federation?
What's the date again?
1830-ish?
Oh, 1830, certainly under the Russian Empire.
Yeah. So, and if you're not familiar with kind of the how Russia was kind of managed at the state level for quite literally until, 1917, the Russian Civil War, they were basically organized under a Tsarist regime, which was the Russian form of monarchy. And for many years, it was the Romanov dynasty. There were a couple dynasties before that. But in the 1830s, some Ukrainian poets were kind of feeling their oats a little bit and proudly kind of declaring their Ukrainian identity in separate ways than what it meant to be Russian. One example of this that we see within Russian literature is the writer Nikolai Gogol. He was born actually in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. He ended up, he was kind of a misfit even when he was younger, and ended up making his way to Moscow and St. Petersburg and kind of being enveloped in the literary circles of the day. There were some stories that he first started writing. Most of them are kind of considered the Odessa stories or the Ukrainian stories. And a lot of these stories incorporate aspects of folklore. And by folklore, I'm talking about, aspects of witchcraft, peculiar people doing peculiar things, funny things happening. Imagine Alice in Wonderland, kind of psychedelic mushrooms, forest people, that kind of thing. And Gogol ended up kind of being taken under the wing by the most prominent Russian poet of all time. He's basically the equivalent of, Shakespeare or Dante. And his name was Alexander Pushkin. And Pushkin really liked a lot of what Nikolai Gogol was doing. But Gogol didn't necessarily like being identified as Ukrainian. It was just his way of acceptance. So there are a lot of letters that Gogol actually writes to his mom saying, tell me how the milk girls are dressing today so I could put it in my stories. I remember you telling me about this story about this crazy old lady that lived in the woods who did these witch tricks. Give me that, because that's what people want here. So also occurring in the 1830s, so this would have been under Tsar Nicholas I. There was a big cultural movement at the Tsar level of wanting to culturally reclaim Ukraine as being kind of the birthplace not of Ukrainian identity, but of Russian identity. There was an incident in, I think it was 1832, where an amateur archaeologist went to a pretty famous site in Kyiv, the Kyiv Golden Gate. And he started doing this excavation under this gate with the intended purpose of finding evidence, hard evidence, that Kyiv was the birthplace of Russia, and it's not actually Ukrainian. And Tsar Nicholas I actually visited this very peculiar archaeological site. This would be like Americans going to England and trying to dig something up to prove that, really England, it's not really itself. It's simply the birthplace of what America became. Under Tsar Alexander II, this is where things kind of start to get interesting. Ukrainian language, like publications in Ukrainian language, are banned. They're taken off the shelves. It is forbidden to give public readings of poetry and put on like theatrical performances in Ukrainian language. This is all under the Tsardom. When Lenin kind of turns everything in that whole region, and you might even argue the globe, kind of up on its head, one of the things that Lenin was actually worried about, his goal was to create communism, like manifest it into the world. And the way that they envisioned it occurring was through the Soviet Union. You get this collection of regions that are not under the same kind of heading, and you group them together, and they're all working kind of in the name of the communist project. One of the things Lenin was concerned with was that Russia might actually be a little bit too big for its britches. So when Putin is saying that Ukraine wasn't actually established until like the Soviets allowed them to be, part of the reason was that Lenin was kind of worried that Russia was going to overpower all of these other kind of independent groups. And it's really difficult. You almost have to look at a globe, like, or a really, really good map to get a sense of just how big, territorially speaking, the landmass of Russia is itself. And when you expand that out to the Soviet Union, there are hundreds of different ethnic groups, hundreds of different cultural groups, and all of them have kind of a shared history, well, A, of being like overrun by Mongols, but of really just kind of history washing over it in very, very bloody ways for a really, really long time. So Lenin's actually kind of concerned with, you know, preserving the communist project, and he's okay with Ukrainian folks kind of gaining, you know, being proud of being Ukrainian. Because after all, it's all in the name of building this bigger communist project. Then Stalin comes on board. There's a whole bunch of stuff kind of surrounding Stalin. We are not going to have nearly enough time to go into a lot of it. But the way that it ends up influencing this situation currently is Stalin started to kind of go back to Romanov era cracking down on, particularly within Ukraine, of, you know, Ukrainian independence movements. So much so that in the 1920s and 1930s, folks who were, you know, basically, you know, at the head of the Communist Party were quite literally going around the streets and rounding up Ukrainian artists and poets and writers. Sometimes they were just summarily executing them and putting them in mass graves. Other times they were detaining them and telling their families, we don't know what happened to them. But to get a sense of how kind of peculiar some of this cultural overlap is, particularly like in the 1930s now, there's two writers that are really interesting to study as it relates to some of this stuff. The first one is Isaac Babel, and he was proudly Jewish, proudly Ukrainian, born in Odessa. And Odessa is a town that's historically been known for its humor. It's currently under siege right now, and there is an Odessa-born American poet who's been sending these dispatches from poets that he knows over there, and they're still telling jokes, even in the midst of what they're experiencing. But Babel really became famous for a couple of things that he wrote. One in particular is called the Red Cavalry stories, and these stories basically document from like a journalist perspective the crazy violence that was happening in the years kind of after the Russian Civil War and during the Russian Civil War, where you have the Red Army and the White Army sweeping through, you know, burning villages, just attacking one another, really just kind of going into a place and saying, which side are you on? And you don't know how to respond. You're given like a couple seconds. And sometimes your answer doesn't even matter. There's just like a really, really kind of peculiar amount of violence in this region in this time. And a lot of Babel's stories reflect that. Babel ended up getting into a bit of hot water because he didn't hold back from using historical figures within his fiction. And he made one Red Cavalry general look particularly buffoonish. Little did Babel know that 10 years later, this person would end up kind of moving into Stalin's inner circle. And as you can imagine, that might turn out all that well. Babel was executed. So this is a Ukrainian-born, proudly Ukrainian, having that identity, writer who was writing kind of against the power of the Soviet regime at the time, and he ended up paying the ultimate price simply for speaking truth to power. At the exact same time, there's another writer who was born in Kiev, around the exact same time that Babel was born. He identified as a Russian. He went to the university in Kiev. And then he ended up kind of making his way to the Moscow circles and writing a lot of plays, getting very involved in Russian theater. His name was Mikhail Bulgakov. But you have a writer who was born in Ukraine and only identifies as Russian. At the exact same time, you have another writer, also born in Ukraine, but kind of vehemently Ukrainian. Bulgakov ended up coming to a not as rough of a fate as Babel. He did end up dying quite young, unfortunately. And the last book that he ended up writing is called Master and Margarita, which is kind of a satirical look at Soviet life in the 1920s and 30s. One of the things that Bulgakov's wife says after her husband has finished this manuscript is, uh-oh, this is going to cause us a lot of trouble. So in some ways, it was kind of a breath of fresh air that Mikhail did not live long enough to see the consequences of potentially publishing this book. It wasn't actually published until 1966. And even up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, this book was one of these closely held secrets. When I was in Russia, I actually went to Mikhail Bulgakov's house in Moscow. It was not a museum, but people at the cultural level, people having they used to call them in the Soviet days, kitchen table conversations. There would be books that people would type out by hand and literally hand one another, like secretly, almost as, like they were KGB agents. But they're passing off poetry and songs and music. And if you got caught with some of this stuff, depending on who happened to be in power at the time, you could pay a very heavy price. I ended up going to Bulgakov's house, and it's full of amazing graffiti that Russians and Soviets over the year had found this place, just simply by word of mouth. And on the walls, you can see all of this graffiti of characters and figures from the books. The person that I studied with when I was over there, he had been in Russia in the late 80s, and one of the things that he said was that he used to go to dinner parties where people would sit around a table. And this was at a time where you could still get in, even though it was the late 80s, you could still get in a little bit of trouble depending on who happened to hear what you were talking about or what you were reading or what you were thinking about. And he would go to these dinner parties, and there would be maybe 10 people around a table, and people would stand up and recite entire pages from this book, Master and Margarita. And they would go around the table, and throughout the course of the evening, they would simply give a recitation because all of these people had committed this dangerous book to memory. So that's just kind of a little bit to give you a sense of some of the odd cultural overlap in terms of how it relates to identity, which is clearly back in the kind of the forefront of all of our thinking now with this current crisis.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. So, in the interest of time, we both committed, and we'll stay here as long as people want to stay and talk. but I know a lot of people don't want to commit to more than the hour. So in the interest of that, we'll get to the questions, and we'll start with the written ones, and then ask you what more you'd like to talk about. We can talk about where we think things are headed. We can talk about the role of various countries involved in this problem. And we can talk about why, at least we think Americans ought to care about this issue, which is rather interesting. I was writing those notes up 2.5 weeks ago, even before the invasion. Like, okay, well, somebody else, well, why should Americans care? And I have been blown over by how much people outside of Ukraine have cared about this since then. It really has been surprising and heartening. So we got 2 questions here. The first one reads, I'm no apologist for Putin's despicable actions, but his views that the Russian quote-unquote empire cannot allow Ukraine to secede has some of Abraham Lincoln's determination that the Confederacy could not leave the Union. Your thoughts? Well, let's just doing history on a pretty big scale, and it's an important question because consistency is an important issue, right? Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
All I would say is that, since 1991, Ukraine had recognized itself and the rest of the world had recognized itself as a sovereign nation. And in the American Civil War, there was a little bit of recognition from other countries that the South had actually, that secession had actually worked. But that's one of the things that makes this issue really stand out to me is this is another sovereign nation that's been invaded.
Right. There is not a legal argument for the Confederacy. The United States Constitution does not include any clauses that say that you can secede from the United States. Once you've entered, you're in. So you can't make a legal argument that the Constitution says you're allowed to leave. Now, the Soviet constitutions, and this may seem a little ironic to you, actually had those clauses. The 1924 Constitution and the 1936 Constitution each said if one of the republics should like to leave, it goes through these procedures. And so the establishment ultimately of an independent Ukraine was accomplished legally according to not only what the Ukrainians wanted, but it was accepted by the Belarusian and by the Russian governments in turn, not only then, but of course in later treaties as well. The purpose for secession, of course, in the United States was to protect slavery. Every one of the secession documents said this is why we're leaving. Not a single one mentioned states' rights. That's a post-Civil War myth that's made up by apologists for the South. That had nothing to do with it at the time in terms of them explaining to themselves and to others why they were leaving. So that's what the Civil War is about. In this case, Ukraine left the Soviet Union legally, just like Russia left the Soviet Union legally. And to go and conquer then a foreign country is, I think, a little different case than that one. Though I can understand why this is, still a question worth asking.
But in some ways, you can almost think about it that like Putin is engaging in a kind of lost cause mythology from the former Soviet days. For those who don't know, Vladimir Putin was a KGB agent stationed in Dresden when the Berlin Wall collapsed. There were protests that were happening outside of his office. And in his biography, he talks about how kind of terrifying this moment was. And he sent off a cable to Moscow. And the reply was, Moscow is silent. So in this moment, Putin is feeling that he's been abandoned. And he's said it publicly multiple times, especially in the past year, that he thinks that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was like the greatest mistake in like world history. That's a really, really big statement, all right? Imagine thinking that you're historically correct in being able to make that, but also having just like the bravado to be able to utter some of that. And so Putin's kind of been engaging in certain kind of like lost cause mythology about the historical relationship between Ukraine and Russia.
So it set the whole question on its head then, and which is always an interesting thing to do for historians, to see it from an entirely different perspective. I think that really works well to help explain it. Putin through and through is a statist. The most important thing is the existence of powerful, stable states. There's no evidence he was ever a really particularly good Marxist. He had to be Marxist enough to be KGB. He had to, of course, not utter anything that could be seen as anti-Marxist, but when it fell apart, he had not a tear for the loss of the ideology. He had a great number of tears for the loss of the empire, though. And that's the way that he has viewed it consistently throughout his life. The second card, here's a quote, "Cleaning up Nazism in Ukraine," end quote. Another quote, "Ukraine is not its own country," end quote. What resonance do these messages have among the Russians and among the Ukrainians? Okay, well, in the case of the Russians, we know the older generation in Russia, which I don't know I might be part of, gets most of their news from the television still. They watch the nightly news in the way that they watched the nightly news back under the Soviet Union. And there's a great deal of consistency in those messages. The message that NATO is your enemy, the United States is a dominant foreign power, you need to be afraid of this, we're the only ones that can protect you from it. That's what they get from the official state media since Putin became president, elected in 2000. And it resonates because it's what they grew up with, what they know. The younger generation is as hip in the cities as anywhere else. And they're using VPNs and they're getting news from absolutely everywhere. I would be careful with Russian polling. When you live in a society where it can be dangerous to express your opinion, you have to be careful about trusting polling. Okay, so I wouldn't try to go with that to figure out what's going on, which means I don't think we really have an idea how to measure opinion in Russia. In Ukraine, I'm sure they see these things as remarkably offensive. When you look at Ukrainian polling, and of course Ukraine has not been a police state with some minor exceptions during the Yanukovych government from 2010 to 2014. During that period, you can say there was definitely a clampdown on individual freedoms there. And during that period, I would have, living in Ukraine, be very careful about answering polls. But what we see in polling in Ukraine otherwise, since 2014 in particular, is an increasingly strengthened idea that Ukraine should be part of the West, Ukraine should be part of the EU, Ukraine should be part of NATO, that we are Europeans. That's something that President Zelensky has said again and again. We are Europeans. We are proving ourselves every day, and we need support. So I don't think these messages go very far in Ukraine. In fact, we really haven't seen evidence come forward of Russian speakers in Ukraine supporting the Russian forces outside of those people who are already supporting separatism in the Donbass provinces. And that is rather interesting, and I think, again, goes to the view that Putin seems to have really misjudged the situation. He misjudged the US, he misjudged NATO, the international community, and he totally misjudged Ukraine.
Yeah, and just to kind of keep in mind, like within historical perspective, in this part of the world, you don't really, I mean, I guess you can casually toss terms around like Nazism, but it means a lot more in these places that were overrun by the Nazis. And within kind of the Russian mindset, now granted it was during the Soviet years, but the Russians have kind of adopted this, this really grand faith in what they considered, what they call their Great War. And that was their war against Hitler. And if you want to know how dedicated, Soviets were to eliminating Hitler, they donated 27 million people to the cause of making their way towards Berlin. After quite a few catastrophic kind of strategic military things early on in the war, they really kind of pushed back. And so, when Putin's using this language, like this Nazi language, Russians do know what this means because it's like one of their proudest moments. It's the proudest moment probably in Soviet history, I would think. When I was in Russia, I actually went to a medical museum and I saw a Nazi. He was pickled, though, and suspended in embalming fluid. And when I saw this, I was like, oh dear. But they didn't have a problem putting this young, blonde-haired boy in a vat of formaldehyde. The other thing that comes to mind when this word Nazi is being thrown around. So you had mentioned Yanukovych. So Yanukovych was mostly considered to be kind of like a Russian puppet. At least he had a lot of allegiance to the Moscow regime. This would have been like 2010. That's, I think, when he won the presidential election. So he was president of Ukraine, but he was considered to be quite close to Moscow. In his election in 2004 against Viktor Yushchenko, Yanukovych actually called Yushchenko a Nazi. So this language coming from like Moscow support to folks who support Ukrainian independence and sovereignty, the language has kind of been carrying through. One of the things to kind of keep in mind with this is that whole kind of sweep in Eastern Europe, it's almost unfathomable. How many Jewish people were murdered during World War II? And by murdered, we're talking about mass graves. We're talking about Nazis sweeping into town, co-opting, and it happened in different ways. But the bloodshed particularly aimed at the Jewish people under the banner of Nazism, it's really, really felt in these places. One of my good friends, he was born in Odessa, he is Jewish, and his family had to leave in the early 80s because there was still a lot of anti-Semitism kind of swirling around in that whole region. But in one of the early days of the bombing, when Russian forces tried to knock out the Kyiv television tower, one of the bombs actually ended up landing at one of the more kind of haunting Holocaust memorials within Ukraine. And it's basically a mass grave where estimates are that about 60,000 Jews who were summarily rounded up in the city of Kyiv, walked to the outskirts of Kyiv, and kind of lined up. So to use this term, it's not quite even like it's not an ad hominem argument. It has a lot of resonance in this area, particularly when Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, happens to be Jewish. So it's very peculiar to have Putin saying he's going in to denazify a place that has a Jewish president. Yeah.
So just picking up on this, and I'm just curious to sort of have your guys' perspective on this. What about the claims that, there is the Sav battalion that is part of the Ukrainian military that is, supposed to be sort of neo-Nazi. So, what, and obviously that's an argument that Putin makes, right? That there are these neo-Nazis that are part of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian state, and collaboration, during World War II and that sort of thing. So just, what's your perspective on that?
Sure. I don't want to get into what's called whataboutism. So I want to try to avoid that. But you remember in the last 2 years, we're getting a lot of reports out of Germany where they became very concerned that there was a great deal of neo-Nazis within their special operations units in particular. The United States, you remember, just during the last 2 years, has all the way up to the Secretary of Defense has made important comments about how we need to do race sensitivity training in the United States military, because they're very much concerned that those kinds of people enter the military, try to get training, which then they will perhaps use in other places. And at the same time, they're of course infecting the military. When I was in the military, you did see Confederate flags around. And I'm so much more conscious today of how that made my black colleagues feel than I was conscious back in the 1980s. But that kind of thing is not unusual. So I don't want to say, well, everybody's got this, but the fact of the matter, everybody does have this. Now, during World War II, you get a great deal of ethnic cleansing across the lands that are now Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. And remember, these are the areas that are going to face the worst situations during World War II. Between 1931 and the beginning of the Soviet-created famine, the Holodomor in Ukrainian, and the end of the bloodletting after World War II had already ended, you lose about 14 million civilians massacred. 14 million civilians. That doesn't count the soldiers at all in these lands. And the Holocaust is just a part of that, right? So that kind of thing was going on, and you do find people from each of these countries on various sides as the army is sweeping back and forth, and as you have to find a way to provide food for your family, which sometimes meant taking it from somebody else who was trying to take it from you to begin with. And so absolutely, were the Ukrainians in the Nazi forces? Yes, there were Ukrainians, just like there were people from every one of these countries that exist now today. In the German Wehrmacht, there were Ukrainians. In the SS. There were Russians in the SS too, and there were Lithuanians, and et cetera, right? So these things do exist, but these things exist across the board in that region too. And Ukraine doesn't stand out as substantially different from any of the other countries today. And it's awkward because, you know, the borders aren't the same as they were. But absolutely, in every large population group, you had people fighting on all sides. Go ahead.
So, I guess, short version of my question is, do you see this war getting outside of Ukraine? Do you see Putin running on steam in Ukraine and trying to force the issue in another country, potentially involving NATO?
Yeah, I read an article today that tried to explain Putin in a way that we used to try to explain things during the Cold War, that, you know, Hitler was a gambler. Hitler taking enormous losses. Hitler could not play chess to save his life. And that the Soviets were chess players. Well, Putin is not a chess player. You know, Putin is a judo master, and in judo, you wait for the other person to do something, and you respond, and you work on your wits, and you work on your intuition, and your immediate assessment of your and your opponent's balance, right? And that seems, I think, to work well enough to explain Putin. He doesn't seem to be a very good planner. He just finds moments where he can take advantage of them. And that seems to be what he can do. NATO has a charter. Article 5 says an attack upon one is an attack upon all. It's only been employed once, right after 9/11, okay? And that was to go after Al-Qaeda, okay? But I think you can count on the NATO charter standing firm, and I think that Putin would not be willing to take a risk that big. Now, intermediately, what if the United States did support a no-fly zone and put U.S. planes in the air there? Putin is in a position, do I fire on them or do I keep all my planes grounded? You know, then you're in a more immediate situation. Of course, there can be accidents. Plenty can go wrong, right, without either side having planned it, and then they got to respond. So I think Putin is looking for weaknesses, looking for opportunities, but I can't imagine that he would want to take on the greatest military power that's ever existed, the United States. There's, you know, Russia's not a superpower. I mean, it's barely even a great power, barely. And they can't even keep their troops fed 50 miles outside of their own borders. You know, where the rail junctions end, you got to go by truck, and the Russian military doesn't have enough trucks. And the Ukrainian resistance has figured this out, and so they're targeting the trucks more than the tanks. Hit the fuel, hit the food supplies, make the Russians uncomfortable and stuck in their tracks. So it would be a great risk for the United States to get much more heavily involved, and you can see this the way the press is reporting it. The U.S. is thinking about this, not sure, they're thinking about this, but things are moving much faster than we would have expected. SWIFT, they debated about 2 days and did it. The U.S. cutting the oil supply off, very short debate, and they did it. And that's a remarkable, strong statement, because that's, of course, going to injure the U.S. economy as well. So the whole question is, how far is Putin willing to push? I think in this kind of situation, you definitely give firm boundaries and say, no, you're past this, and we are at war. So, you know, where those boundaries exactly are is something we, you know, we'll know as time goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons I have so this is the NATO map here. Right around in here is the port city of Odessa. And it's a, you know, strategically speaking, if the Russian military were to capture this area, it would be a very, very big win for them because so that's Crimea there. They would almost have blocked Ukraine off from waterway, which would mean all humanitarian or military assistance would have to come in from these other borders. But look how close you are to the Romanian border. And that's a NATO state. And one of the things that I've at least been observing in terms of like the incompetence of Russian military action at kind of like multiple levels is, you know, there was the incident just a few days ago when Russian soldiers were opening fire on a nuclear facility. You know, they ran their way through Chernobyl, churning up all sorts of like radioactive mud. When fighting starts to get close to a border, I think that's where like US and NATO members they're really watching. I don't think any of them really want this to get out of control, but who knows?
Okay, I've got another question. Why hasn't the Russian Navy bombarded Odessa or Mariupol? Where is the Ukraine's Navy? Will Moldova be invaded after Ukraine? Also not in NATO, as a clarification here. So the Russian Navy bombarding Odessa and Mariupol. So far, Odessa hasn't been advanced upon by land forces. That's pretty far in the west, and the Russians are having trouble much closer to their own borders. Now, the fleet in the Black Sea does include amphibious units. I don't know where they are exactly right now. So far as Mariupol goes, that's up by the sea. It's off there. I am not sure. I don't know enough about the geography to know how far or how close in they can move the ships. And one thing is it's hard to resupply a ship. So if you're going to be worried about perhaps having to deal with somebody out at sea, you probably aren't going to want to use the ships. You'll want to use land-based artillery, rockets, etc. I think it'd be much easier for them and to maintain those other assets. Ukraine's Navy, I know nothing about this. Do you know anything about?
I know they have a few ships.
Yeah, I don't think it's a major fleet. And so you want to save it, right, instead of lose it.
So on the kind of Navy front, everything in this region has a historical tie-in to it. So you see that little pocket up there, and you see this little spot right here, going all the way back to Peter the Great. One of the things that Peter the Great was obsessed with, he was one of the first Russian princes to kind of make a grand tour of Europe, and he was obsessed with sailing. And so when he got back to Russia, and he's the one who built St. Petersburg up here, one of the things he was obsessed with was building a navy. But look at that access, look at that water access there, and then you have to navigate all through Sweden, Denmark. I mean, you are literally running a gauntlet if you're wanting to have a navy that can fight. Here, all of the ships that might come around from there have to go through the Bosphorus Straits. And Turkey has said that they've shut down military access at a naval level in order to be able to do much. Who knows?
So the last bit was about Moldova. And there are Russian troops in the Transnistrian region there, right on the Ukrainian-Moldova border. Would they be invaded? I think it's a question of opportunity, of whether Putin thought he could sometime later in this, because of course you're right, they're not part of NATO. But there's a question of how much do you think you could do? You know, occupying a country of 45 million people, who, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks, are highly motivated not to let you occupy them. That's remarkable. That is a far more military sophisticated group of people than the United States faced in its recent wars, and a much larger group of people, and we couldn't win those wars. our military is so much more sophisticated than the Russians. The inequality was much greater. Here, they're much closer together. And so I can't imagine, Russia occupying successfully Ukraine, let alone going any further.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction, the difference between just invading a place and blowing it to smithereens and then occupying it. And you've all probably seen images on social media of like Russian or like Ukrainian babushkas getting together and making Molotov cocktails. Boy, I've been trying to jog my head thinking of what other kind of resistance an invading force has met, and every inch of ground, however long Russia wants to hold it, it's going to be a struggle for however long. Yeah, is that Lauren?
Yeah.
Oh, hi Lauren.
I guess I have a couple of related questions. So given the way that things are bogging down for the Russian troops, do you think that there is a point at which there is an exit strategy, or does this bog down into a continual territorial dispute like the Kashmir region in Southeast Asia or anything like that? And then given what's happening with the Russian economy, and we've seen the massive protests of people in Russia despite the risk to themselves, is this a situation where there could potentially be a regime change given enough popular discontent in Russia itself? The latter seems unlikely to me given the state apparatus that Putin has for himself, but I'm curious what you think.
Go for it.
Okay. Let's see where to start with it. Well, we once had something called the Powell Doctrine. After the Vietnam War, General Paul ultimately came up with the doctrine that you don't go into a country if you don't know how to get back out of it. And we pursued that during the Gulf War. Now, of course, during the Iraq War and during the Afghan War, we didn't really have an idea how to get out and stayed there year after year after year without much in the way of success. Success would go up and down, but no ultimate ending to either of those wars to the benefit of U.S. policymakers. So Putin doesn't appear to have gone in with a clear idea of what to do if things go badly. He doesn't have contingency plans. It's not even clear what he thought he was going to do. Perhaps decapitate government. Maybe he brings up Yanukovych back and Yanukovych rules Ukraine for him until such time as perhaps it could be annexed into Russia. I think that would be his ultimate ideal. How long does that take? Well, who knows? And then if that doesn't work, what do? You can't imagine, I think, a Russian puppet leader in Ukraine surviving today once he's put into office. I can't imagine how Putin is processing this. He's a remarkably isolated individual. I mean, we've seen the pictures of the conference tables, and him. And I think that's a picture showing the actual state of affairs that he lives in. He's got yes men around him, but not very close to him. He doesn't hear alternative points of view. He comes up with his plan, and nothing is going right, including just basic military competence. That's not happening. So how does he declare victory and go home? How do you manage that? The further he gets in, the more the Russian people suffer, the more the oligarchs, as much as they are oligarchs anymore, will think about turning against him. And, if you want to maintain a police state, you got to have enough police willing to follow orders. There comes a point where they no longer see that as in their interest. And of course, if he were to attempt a nuclear strike, that could be the moment that they say enough. That could be the moment that they get rid of him. And that's happened before to dictators. Losing a war is the worst thing that can happen for the strength and the popularity of a government.
And it's happened in Russia.
And it has.
With Tsar Nicholas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, there's a hand here.
You said early on that the air war was going poorly. Can you explain why that is? I kind of thought that would be a determining factor early.
Yeah, we all did, and that's the problem is, what we know is what we've been reading in the press, and they all believed that it would. And the United States was sending all these warning messages to the Ukrainians. I think that the Russians, at least in the first week, were practicing a lot of restraint. Because if your idea is to go and decapitate the government and then rule the place, you can't kill too many people along the way, or the civilian population turns against you. Since the armies have bogged down, they've turned to that bombardment and to the much greater loss of civilian life, although we don't quite have the measurement of that yet. But we know, how much has been happening in terms of rockets and missiles falling. Could be a question of aviation fuel. I haven't heard anything about people refusing to follow orders yet. So I don't know that any of that has happened. It's kind of a mystery. I mean, I would have thought they would have hit them much harder, much faster. And even now, they don't seem to be using everything at their disposal.
Well, the air-to-ground missiles especially effective?
Yeah. Ukraine has been, from all accounts that I've read, it doesn't seem like the Russian military was expecting as much of resistance on the ground, but also on the ground to the air.
Yeah.
I mean, do you remember?
The Stinger missiles are pretty effective.
And I think
And the
it's something like
javelins.
80 airplanes and helicopters have been knocked down already on the Russian side.
Yeah, in vehicles a week ago, they were counting them in the high hundreds. So there's, those American shoulder-mounted weapons are very effective. And of course, they're getting weapons from Germany and elsewhere now. I mean, that's an interesting thing, right? Germany is now willing to provide lethal aid to a country in a conflict. It hasn't done that since World War II.
Yeah.
And you might count German troops in the Afghan operation, but that's a little bit different situation. Germany has pledged to go well over the 2% GDP threshold in the funding of its military, which 2% is what was negotiated with the Obama administration. And I think it was about 2025 that Germany was supposed to have gotten there. Now they say, nope, this year we're going well north of 2%. And lots of other militaries in NATO say, we're going to step up spending too. And so there's nothing like this to concentrate the mind. And so that's, again, something that wasn't expected.
And it seems there's one of the overall themes that I've been seeing in journalists that I'm following on the ground and listening to some U.S. military briefings, which are often thin on information, but you can kind of hear things coming between the lines, is that at a military level, it's difficult to come up with comparisons about how much of a debacle this has been on the Russian side. I mean, their vehicles are bogging down in mud. They're getting flat tires because it doesn't look like there was basic truck maintenance done. Clearly it's difficult to judge the veracity of all of the information coming through, but a lot of it just seems to be they thought they could do this very, very easily, and now they're having to. A lot of operations are pretty much stalled because of the resistance that they're finding. So just to kind of keep in mind, one estimate that I saw was that the Russian military numbers were somewhere around 270,000 soldiers total. Along the border, they had amassed, at least estimates that have been kind of going around, are 190,000 Russian soldiers. It turns out some of the reports that have been breaking in the last couple of days is that roughly about the U.S. military thinks that about 95% of Russian forces that were amassed upon the border have already kind of crossed in and engaged. And we don't know if they're active engagement or if they're just kind of, working behind the lines. But it also seems that a big contingent of the Russian force was made up of police officers, folks that were quite literally meant to come in and control street crowds once a government had toppled. We don't know what the percentage of that is, but that's kind of telling, at least in terms of what the Kremlin thought it was getting involved in. They thought they could just decapitate head of state and declare military, raise a flag and put in their puppet, and so they were going to send in waves of police officers after that. But if what's been amassed along the border is 190,000 troops in the Russian military, and it's mostly conscripts. And this is a big, big difference, right? One of the reasons that the U.S. military has been historically effective, post-Vietnam is because it's a volunteer force. These are kids, these are 18, 19-year-old kids who, if you're not at a university studying, you're going into the army. And a lot of these, they aren't, not what we think of when we think of soldiers a lot of times. And so there's just been a lot of miscues, misreads from the Russian perspective. So,
yeah, at least under the Soviet Union, I don't know about post-Soviet Russia, but the Soviet Union, all male students were what we would call ROTC students. You're commissioned upon graduation. And all the guys I knew when I lived in the Soviet Union were not the least bit military-minded. They would go on these maneuvers and such with no enthusiasm at all. The one analogy I can find directly is the Crimean War, 1854 to 56. The failure of Russia within the bounds of its own country led to the end of serfdom, that great era of reform in the 1860s. Get rid of serfdom so we can finally change the economy and industrialize. They changed the political administrative system. They changed the judicial administrative system. All of that finally happened once they had lost this war. Not that they hadn't been talking about it for almost a century, but they finally pulled the trigger. Alexander II pulled the trigger because you can't run a country this way when you can't even fight within your own borders. So even if Putin stays in power, there's going to be some important changes. There was a hand over here, though.
This question might sound ironic, and I do understand we cannot draw a conclusion at this point. But again, I would like to hear from you. What do you think about the situation? How it is going to end? Will it escalate further? Is there a chance for World War III?
Well, for World War III, you'd need to have roughly equivalent forces on two sides. To call it, to be what we would think of it as a world war. The problem, of course, is if you think of Russia on one side and the US, or it's, Britain and France, they're nuclear powers. And what happens when nuclear powers go to war? During the Cold War, the US and the Soviets were very careful with one another. If one side made it very clear that this is a vital interest to us, the other side tended to back down. 1956, the United States did not intervene in Hungary. In 1968, didn't intervene in Czechoslovakia. During the Korean War, certainly there were Russian pilots, Russian operatives on the ground, but we all pretended they weren't there. And that Chinese army of volunteers, we all pretended were volunteers. So the United States did not have to admit that it was war with China, and China didn't have to admit that it was war with the United States.
And Afghanistan with the Soviet Union when the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen.
Right, so countries tend to be very careful with other nuclear powers. The difference in the treatment of Iraq under Saddam Hussein versus North Korea is a pretty strong example that people tend to raise. I would certainly hope that would lead to restraint on both sides. If this thing just kind of keeps going the way it is, Putin is going to find himself in a more and more dangerous situation within Russia. Not the Americans, not foreigners, with Russians. And so a defensive war, an insurgency war favors the defense. It favors the home team, not the foreigners. And I do not see any evidence the Ukrainians are going to give up. And so, Zelensky, greatest political hero already in all of Ukrainian history. And it's really rather reassuring that he's Jewish, which again, this is not a country that has a good record of religious tolerance. I mean, the whole region has had tremendous problems over the centuries with that question in mind. And here you have a Jewish president who is the hero of the moment. He's done, essentially, in the big terms, everything right for Ukraine, and cemented himself, I think, in their hearts. Putin doesn't have that. And really, the Russian economy has been awful since 2008. Really good from 2000 to 2008, and it has never recovered from that setback. And all it is today is a raw materials exporter, so it's really at the mercy of the international markets. And right now, you know, they're selling oil at a discount just to get some foreign currency in. So, you know, it's the longer it goes on, the way it is, the worse it is for Putin. So,
Yeah.
there's a hand down here first, though.
I have a couple questions. Could you comment on the food security in the event this conflict continues? Some years ago, I read a book called Harvest of Sorrow about what happened in Ukraine and Georgia in the 1930s. And,
Robert Conquest.
is it analogous today that is Ukraine an exporter of food?
Ukraine's an exporter, Russia's a big exporter of grain. Right now, there's trouble finding export markets because more and more companies, or more and more countries don't want to work with Russia. And so, same with companies, I believe Maersk, right, the largest shipper on the planet, won't take anything Russian anymore. And so getting it out of Russia and getting it to a market and getting paid, that's the hard part without SWIFT, right? So that's a big question. That's going to affect food prices, you know, potentially globally, different in different places, of course. Ukraine, how much longer does this have to go on before they can't do the spring planting? That's a big concern. What's that going to mean for Ukrainian farmers? What's that going to mean for Ukrainian and global food supplies? Certainly there's enough food, and you can certainly bring more acreage under the plow, and you can certainly release strategic reserves to get through a matter of months or I don't know, perhaps years. But getting that aid to the people who need it in Ukraine will be the difficult part. And so food security becomes a greater problem as we go through this, just as fuel security is a problem.
Is the Russian parliament, is it still called the Duma?
Yeah.
Is that a non-player? Do they have any role?
So far, Putin has it all locked up. He has absolute control over it, but remember, you know, you have absolute control over people until they decide no longer. And when that happens, as we've seen in revolutionary situations in many countries, that can happen really fast because everybody has to day in and day out make an individual decision. And if a momentum starts going in one direction, you don't want to be not part of that momentum. So I'm always reminded of July 27th, 1794. Robespierre stands up in front of the convention and says, "I've got a list of enemies of the Republic." And pretty soon, people in the convention, this is their assembly time, says, "Yeah, I got a list too, and you're on it." And they denounced him and ultimately guillotined him. So those things can turn around just like that. And you just, you know, and then we're all caught flat-footed and wondering why we didn't see it coming.
And there's been a lot of speculation about, you know, like the timing of why Putin may have decided to do this now. One of the things that I keep hearing pretty regularly is that there isn't all that much opposition within the Duma. And if some of you have been following some of the laws that have been passed, you know, you could potentially face upwards of like 15 years in prison by calling this a war and not referring to it within the Kremlin language of a strategic military operation. So that's going to keep people quiet, even just like the rumblings of that. Another reason why Putin might have acted now is there isn't that much of a, basically an anti-corruption or an anti-Putin leader in Russia right now. One of the earliest kind of Putin critics was a politician by the name of Boris Nemtsov, and he was the governor of Nizhny Novgorod when I was there, so I was always kind of following what he did. He was the deputy prime minister under Boris Yeltsin. There was discussion even in like the late 90s about whether or not Nemtsov would be kind of tabbed to be the next Russian president, but then it kind of ended up going to this no-name bureaucrat named Vladimir Putin. I mean, they sent him off to the FSB, basically what became the Russian KGB for a year to kind of get some stuff, get some experience under his wings. But Nemtsov was shot down. in 2015, the day before he was supposed to lead a massive peace protest in the streets of Moscow. And the peace that he was hoping for was peace within Ukraine with what was happening in the Donbass region in 2014. So Nemtsov was executed. The last kind of prominent Putin critic that's come to prominence in the last couple of years is a lawyer by the name of Alexei Navalny. And about 2 years ago, he was poisoned. And then he decided to make his way back to Russia, and the Russian forces arrested him under charges of him breaking his parole because he was seeking treatment, because there's a good chance that he was poisoned by Putin folks because he was an outspoken critic, and he's now locked up in a Siberian prison. So there isn't much of like a big opposition voice, even much less opposition voices within the governmental structure.
In the event that like Russia did manage to fully occupy the Ukraine, but like didn't go any further, what do you think like the international community's response to that would be? Like, do you see these sanctions holding up long term, or would they try to enforce harsher consequences? What would that be, or would they just kind of, or like keep lending support to try to like reclaim Ukraine as an independent state, or just kind of let it go to avoid getting drawn into it directly?
So yeah, so let's say, that, well, I don't know if we can get the other map up
Which one do you
again.
need?
If Russian forces prove capable of occupying the entire country, remember this is an extremely large place with 45 million people. If they can manage to do that, they will still face an insurgency, so a continual bloodletting of Russian troops and Russian treasures that keep having to pay to keep the soldiers there. The reason why I think we have seen such a strong, we've seen such a strong, unprecedented international response to this has been because among the Europeans, I think they see things categorically different when they occur in Europe than in other places in the world. They get very, upset, excited about these kinds of things. How much more can you do in terms of sanctions? There's not a lot left, but already we have crippled the Russian economy. And the Russian people are going to be suffering more and more every single week that this thing goes on. And the deeper they go in, the worse it's going to be for them because the expenses are going to go up. So it's hard to imagine the Russians maintaining themselves in that environment and Putin being able to do anything more than just keep that occupation going. I don't see anybody else, as the atrocities mount, changing direction and deciding to lift the sanctions. I think that U.S. and NATO allies will find increasingly harsh ways, short of putting boots on the ground, as we call it, in Ukraine to counter the Russians, the Russian government. And again, it's important, we all say the Russians, etc., as shorthand. But again, we don't have a lot of evidence that this is going to be supported long-term by anybody outside of Putin's grasp.
And when Putin kind of came to power, one of the things that he communicated pretty regularly to the Russian people to try and win them over, even though he was head of state, was promising things like economic stability and rebuilding the glory of Russia. When I was there in '99, the exchange rate was roughly 25 rubles per dollar. In the last week, it's now, it's like 138 I saw, and it might even be lower. So even the average Russian folks who are just trying to buy groceries, imagine everything costing 4 times more, maybe not overnight, but I would imagine with how tight these sanctions are, and really kind of overwhelming these sanctions are, it has a lot of Russians wondering in a week or so, if they're going to have a job, because they're places of employment. One of the things that's happened within kind of the globalist world, one of the things that I've been thinking about is it's a lot of, conspiracy-minded, like anti-globalist folks who want to blame globalists on, like creating, like literally almost starting World War III. Like that was a danger of them. One of the things we're seeing is that like globalism has really kind of mustered its own resources to put a halt to world war, to something potentially on a global scale being very catastrophic. How it ends though, there's a lot of Russian billionaires who have, based on the way things are going, these are folks who were enjoying their Italian villas and being able to fly to London to go to the theater, just kind of on a whim. And we've even seen, like, Germany was going through and confiscating, these oligarchs' yachts and things like that. How long does that hold? Because these people are people who, in a lot of ways, were enriched after they were all enriched for the most part after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Putin had a hand in, giving these folks contracts, even military contracts to build the facilities for the Olympics in Sochi, contracts to build, all the soccer stadiums that went up when the World Cup was there. These are folks who have had a taste of life that is not quite Soviet anymore. And I don't know. I don't see him being able to hold out all too long before trying to apply whatever kind of pressure that they can. And what that looks like, nobody knows.
Yeah, one of the things important to remember in this is this whole Putin operation has been a direct attack on the international state system that the United States was foremost in pioneering going all the way back to 1944. Remember, before World War II was over, we had the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire. And that spawned, of course, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, this idea that the way you avoid depressions that lead to the rise of people like Adolf Hitler, that misery, is to create a stable international system of financial transactions so that currencies remain relatively stable, so that businesses can plan to do international business, so that we start thinking in a global, regulated, controlled system, so we don't end up with these terrible ups and downs in the market economy. And then, of course, after that, 1945, you get the United Nations, and then after that, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs that become the World Trade Organization ultimately. EU is ultimately found in NATO, et cetera, this whole idea of locking countries into mutual reciprocal agreements has really been the American mission since World War II. And Putin is trying to go back to an age of imperial power distribution. And I think there's far too much wealth and interest, particularly on the part of the United States, in not allowing that to happen. That the Americans, the British, et cetera, the other powerful countries who have a vested interest in maintaining the system as it is, can't let this go.
Yeah, and Russia is incredibly resource rich. And Vladimir Putin actually wrote his dissertation on, how potentially do you control the actions of other governmental entities that might want to stop you from doing certain things. Well, you get them addicted to oil, and then they can't really do anything. This is going back years that he's been thinking about some of these things. And Russia has timber, like the majority of the world's nickel, lots of aluminum, lots of lithium. Things that, timber clearly, but things that our technological life really kind of depends on with some of these rare earth elements. The problem is it's one thing to have a resource, but if you don't have a market, or your only market is China, you're really kind of boxing yourself in a lot of ways of how people are going to engage with you.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. We're happy to stick around. others have questions.
Ron Suni was one of my advisors.
Oh, gosh, he's good.
Yeah, we call him Ronnie the Red.
Yep.
Tried to get us to read Das Kapital. I tried and only got about halfway through.
Well, it's
know what?
big. It is big.
I have read the abridged version of Wealth of Nations, not the whole thing
Yeah.
either. And, right, too dry and